interrupting cow.
Says moo.
So we were saying we should get a sound clip from when Obi-Wan describes the cantina as a den of villainy. Just as our intro clip, and like describing each person.
Speaking of intro, I am C4. To my right is the Gray Scree Goblin. To my south is Insanieac.
The Gray Scree Goblin.
And then to my adjacent is Sir Jeremy. Sarah Vike is not hopefully going to join us later. We are your hosts for the Villains Talk Show. We are here to talk about basically random stuff in a roundtable format, mostly whatever catches our mind. And today's topic is world building, from games to books. We're all writers or DMs in some aspect, so we all build worlds. And believe it or not, not all the worlds we build are evil. If you want to join us or support us, likeness.com and get the app, or Patreon is Patreon Minion Hub. Become a minion. Other than that, today's topic, world building. Like I said, we all build worlds. I, as a writer, science fiction, one of my mantras in writing is start with the world and then work from there. Build the world, build the history, and then build a story in the middle of it. That way you have a beginning, middle, and end. I also do that when it comes to DMing. When I DM Dungeons & Dragons, with my characters or whomever I'm DMing for, even if it's a one-shot, I'll take time to build the world. I find it's one of the things that draws me to those kind of games and those kind of books is I build a world, and it's not that I like the things I be into it to be insignificant. It's easier to draw on, and it's easier to build a more interesting and more intricate world, in my sense, around something when you have the world built already. It makes it feel like it's more alive to me. So in my D&D campaign currently, I have, even though it's only been running for like 4 to 5 months, I have like 2 books worth of history written that I use to draw upon. And in my science fiction novels, I try to imagine the history of the whatever I'm describing first, and then I try to just insert my characters inside that history. Inside, usually a moment of change is usually where I like to write. So I'm gonna open the floor. Tell me about your world buildings, guys. I know Andrew and Jeremy are DMs. Oh, there's Sarah. Just missed the intro. Perfect timing. And she's not. Well, we'll wait for her, but let's start with... Well, there she is. A little quiet, if you want to turn up your mic.
Oh, I'll be right back.
Sarah also is a writer as well. She focuses more on fantasy. So, but let's start the floor with to my medium right to Insanieac.
So I've done like a little bit of wording in the way of a recent campaign that I kind of started. I tried to set up a setting of like an elemental setting, like a homebrew kind of world. So I took quite a bit of history, trying to find a way to make elements kind of combine, and I took a bit of time learning about like the D&D lore that was kind of like preset, but I took the time to make my own kind of like world and my own kind of realms of different things. I ended up making 6 different elemental planes essentially, with their own like cities, factions, rulings, and various things like that. Their own like, I hadn't gotten quite too deep into each area's specific like NPCs and whatnot, because we only got into the one realm at the time. The time that I had built was it was a pretty dark and evil kind of realm, because that's what we do. We're evil villains sometimes, and it's it's fun. And I made like an evil dark city ruled by like a necromancer pope, essentially like a dread lord lich. He was trying to achieve like full lichdom, but he wasn't quite there. the party was like related to this character, and then they ended up in between the war of a werewolf and a vampire feud, essentially, that had been going on for quite some time. And they got to explore it around to see. I was also at the edge of a decaying forest full of like infecting mushrooms and spores and fungus, and like it was kind of like Last of Us style. You go into it, and if you were there for too long, you start to breathe and start to get affected and turn into like a spore servant, essentially.
So just a quick question, just so when you build your lore or when you build your world, do you build it around your characters or do you put your characters inside the world?
I mainly kind of put the characters inside the world, but I did build lore around the characters once I understood who the characters were and what they do. I try to make each character feel tangible to the whole story, at least, have an effect and a feeling of belonging before you're really there, at least a little bit.
Do you do that often? Like from what it sounds like to me is you basically set up a bare bones world. You have some lore, and then when you insert your characters inside it, you sort of then color everything out with it.
Yeah, to some degree, that's kind of how I made it. And then, like for me, like pretty much like I like to think of it in a way of like a computer's kind of like rendering. The rest of it hasn't rendered because you haven't gotten there yet, and as it goes, that starts to be further explored. But a number of things like gods and monsters and factions and things, I have a bit of pre-knowledge that I've made of like key figures that are in charge of them. So it's not quite still bare bones. It's just not like fully fleshed out until the need is there, because it would require like a lot of time that I don't always have. So I usually try to leave that to be fleshed out with my characters and the players to some degree.
All right. What about south of me? How much world building do you do, Mister Goblin?
I don't do it as often as I'd like. I'll be honest. I have been trying to write a one-shot for the last, almost a year now.
I've been very interested in this one shot.
Really? Takes you a year?
Yeah.
What are
Mostly
the difficulties?
Because of procrastination.
Mostly procrastination. I can understand that.
Yeah.
Procrastination is a death. I mean, as you guys have known from watching me work sometimes, I can just it is a skill because I can just make a one shot at the top of my head. So my viewers understand is one day we all have a party chat, and one day we're all talking, and out of nowhere, out of just my knowledge of my city, I do a real life one shot with people in chat. And
it'd be very interesting.
And I just used real places in my city, and it wasn't really creative, but because I already had the world it would be in, but it does take a certain level of creativity to be able to do it at a quick pace. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to do it. I mean, procrastination is the killer of artistry. So then let's move on to Sir Jeremy. Well, hopefully Sara figures out what's going on with her stuff.
I'm trying to ring her, see if we can get her back. She said she just can't join the phone.
Well, yeah. Why don't you take it away, Jeremy? Tell us about your world building while I see if I can reinvite.
This world building is sponsored by tea.
No. Coffee.
Tea.
Actually, I've been cutting down, like hardcore cutting down. I have a coffee in front of me, but this is...
As the only tea drinker in the group.
I think, this is my first one for the day.
I drink tea too.
This is like my 3 or 4th.
I'm very sad
I've been cutting
by
down
that.
hard.
Why would you tell me that? Coffee is Cone of the Gods.
See, John's the far left of coffee, and I'm the far right of tea.
To add something,
I used to be the same for coffee, but I don't know. I've just been cutting down lately.
I'm trying to cut out like soda.
No particular reason.
But yeah, world building, Jeremy. You've probably had the most experience with this out of all of us.
I mean, I kind of cheated too because I started with a pre-existing one. I used old lore and kind of built on top of it, and then you turn the whole world on top of itself and create your own lore from scratch.
Yeah, that's what I was inspired by Jeremy's because he was my first kind of DM. So I understand his kind of like DMing style, world building style, and I took that as a kind of in my own kind of way.
So, but
That's
okay,
very
so you
similar.
started with bare bones, but nowadays, like I know in the campaign you're running with us, like there is parts obviously you've taken from the original works by Watsy, but
Yeah.
there's a lot that you've built in yourself. And how much of that was the characters you played with, and how much of that was you?
Probably 50-50. Yeah, I'd say probably about 50-50.
And I know
I write a big chunk, and then the players, I try to tailor the story more towards the players. So their actions definitely do change things. But, I mean, I have to have choices for them to make, right? I guess, technically. So I have that, usually. But then you always gotta... Your players are always surprised you can do, like, other random things. So for me, it was always have to have at least 2 provinces around the surrounding area for them to go and do and know is there, so that way they don't feel like it's a devoid, empty world. And then next thing you know, that's where they want to go. So I'm having to write forward and forward and forward, even though the players aren't even like close to these areas yet. And I almost do it in a fashion of like old school RPGs. Like this area almost doesn't really activate and do its thing.
And I know you're way more fluid, because I know in the way I DM and the way I write, I'm very directive. Like my players, sure, they have choices they can make, and in my stories, sorry, I was just gonna say, in my stories, you obviously I direct it, but yeah, like I don't really allow that kind of variance, and I
don't allow.
That's
no,
funny.
I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I started like that. I definitely started like that. And then the improv just became more and more natural as you get more and more comfortable with the world you're living in, if you know, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you know more and the players know more, it just becomes natural to start moving through certain areas.
Have you ever tried writing, or have you only?
Yeah, I have. And procrastination's the one that kills me on that one too.
Yeah.
I was interested in doing comics at a point.
Kills us all, man. Don't let it get you down. We're all bad at procrastination.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am.
So, Sarah, just so you catch up, all we've been talking about is world building. I'm sure you have lots on this. We've been talking mostly
so much.
mostly about DMing, but I did say that when I world build, I like to build the world first. With the campaign I'm running with you,
Yeah, me too.
and with my books, I like to write the history. I like to write major events. I like if I have 2 books already filled for our campaign. And it's only ran for 5 months, and it's just lore that I've written.
Oh, scary.
And right,
Yeah.
so everything, and I like to make everything as much connected as possible, and that's how I like to run things. So talking now, I do sci-fi, and I know you do fantasy. So talking a fantasy world, that must be a lot easier for you, because with sci-fi, it's a linear timeline in one sense. Like I can place when certain technologies are built, I can place when certain things happen, and then I can always reference back to that kind of chronology. Where when I think of fantasy, like it's like you can't, unless you're like in medieval times. It's not like you're thinking 935. Arthur pulled the sword from the stone and slayed the mighty dragon with his. You get where I'm going?
Yeah.
Well, in high fantasy, you don't have to worry about that because it's set in an alternate world.
But do you still go with like the J.R.R. Tolkien version of it, where like, because I know he was infamous in saying like, you want your characters to interact with an echo of something. You don't want them to interact with the actual big calamity. Like even in Harry Potter, Voldemort's real big claim to fame was back in the 50s, like years before, whatever, like 20 years before Harry Potter. And then, or I don't know how that, I've never actually read the books. Don't murder me on
The
that.
late 70s.
But yeah, like the point is,
Yeah.
but I guess my point is so when you write your fantasy, do you do that? Do you set up a kind of chronology, or?
It's like that's an interesting like thought process. Like
So,
in my mind, because I didn't thought about that.
I think really there's an easy way to do it and a hard way to do it, and I picked the hard way, which is that I want to write stories that shift through time. So I want to write 5 books, and they shift through like 2,000 years worth of history. So essentially, for each one, I have to create a new history.
Have you ever thought about? Okay, well, please first elaborate. Then I have some ideas on that.
First, elaborate. So the one that I've just written, because I told you guys a couple weeks ago, I finished it, sort of. I'm adding a bunch right now, but it's set very near to the beginning of the world. The world is brand new and everything is still being discovered and such. The next one, however, so it's the time period that I'm sort of setting it around is the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. I'm trying to pull bits from our history around those time periods and use them as a setting for this, which is a little tricky. The next one will be sort of a medieval time frame. It'll be several hundred years later in that world, but quite a bit later in reality. And it's going to keep moving forward like that until the final one actually is in the future, sort of the near future.
Okay.
Interesting.
Do you find that kind of limits your design space because you're hopping so much? Or
Yes and no. I'm dealing with elves, so they live a very long time.
I would say, if I may, like I'm in my story that I'm kind of working on, like I'm doing different realm space, so it's not quite the same as doing different time, but in each realm space has its own history and its own kind of like setting, its own set of people, unique. Yeah. When I planned for my campaign, I actually planned for a new party in each realm before they got there.
That's impressive, because I definitely have to work with smaller design spaces to have more ideas. Mm-hmm. So like I do science fiction. I usually do I forget what the actual name of it, but I call it intergalactic science fiction. Like cool. Star to star, kind of like cool. Think of like Starship Troopers, Dune, Star Wars. And like I noticed that when I read epics, the only one I really jive with is the Dune series, because I find that when I focus on a planet, I want the story to pertain to that planet. I want to dive into that planet. And the way I see it is in each planet or each area in space that I travel to in my books, like there's billions of years worth of history there.
Yeah.
And whether my characters right? Whether my characters even touch it doesn't matter. The point is I build that in so that if I ever wanted to and I ever magically become famous enough, I could release like just an encyclopedia that isn't a story, but just it goes through all the areas and I have history written. It's the same in my game that I'm running. There are certain places that I know my players like Sara are never going to go to, but I have history written. I have entire events that happen, and if just so happen they decide to detour and go to some random area, I have lore there. It may not be towards the main quest what they're doing, but at the same time, it's not that it's an empty area. Like I find that's what excites me the most. It's what keeps me writing. I get bored with writing main stories a lot. Like if I could find a way to like paint landscapes with words and get paid for it, that's like that would be amazing. That would be my job.
See, for a lot of like the work I've done for like my kind of campaign setting, like I've built like a number of like I have a history and a mindset plan of what I'm going to do with it and how that kind of world has been like that realm has been set up to some degree as a prehistory. But I don't set up the current history usually until people start exploring that kind of like aspect of that kind of campaign.
I have a question for the table. How do you deal? And I'll answer it first, and I'll open it up to everybody. How do you deal with gods? So in my settings, the good thing about science fiction is I get one of two avenues to work down. I can either work with the most obvious avenue, which there is no gods. Most science fiction projects down that way. However, the most eye-catching science fiction and some of the most compelling science fiction, Frank Herbert's Dune and Star Wars, is the opposite. There are gods in those universes. In Frank Herbert's Dune, God eventually manifests as the God Emperor of Dune. And in Star Wars, the elemental force of good and evil is just one entity that pushes and flows and creates the Force.
Well, and then you get the Force.
Yeah. There's more to it.
The priestess of the Force, and right.
But
it's further explored.
My point is so like when I work with, and I usually don't put in a pantheon, but in some of the short stories or some of the experiments I've done with writing, and I throw in a pantheon, I find it hard pressed to keep the fantasy elements down. And that's where I'm always in awe of people like George Lucas and Frank Herbert, who can instill those magical elements, but not make them a focus, but make them an addition. Make them something. Make them.
Saying that the Force isn't the focus of Star Wars.
But it isn't, because in the first book, in the first movie, what do you see that shows the magic of the Force? Only one thing, and that's when Darth Vader force chokes the One Moff. That's the only thing.
Or when Obi-Wan disappears when he's hit like the lightsaber.
Okay, I'll give you that. He disappears, and the force choke. That's it. That movie is almost 2 hours.
See, it's because with gods, you're supposed to be built in as a force of nature of the world, not supposed to be an accessory to, not supposed to be a part of the story.
I agree.
Like
and then
they have their moments, but they're not supposed to.
I was just going to say in episode 2, if you think about The Empire Strikes Back, when do you see another use of force powers? When the only time is when Darth Vader throws a couple things at Luke Skywalker near the end. He pulls off a couple things off a wall and throws them at Luke. But it's so rare.
There's a number of things too. Vader disarms Han. But he catches the lasers. There's a couple of things. They're subtle. They're subtle things, right?
Yeah, and it's so well worked in. Like it doesn't become the focus. I find it's hard for me when you have these kind of things that you want to draw into focus. So, just to reiterate my question, how do you guys deal with gods, and how do you work that into your stories or your world building? We'll start with Jeremy. Haven't heard from him in a little bit.
So quiet down.
I don't know. Like I said, I usually have like a base universe, and then we try to like turn everything on its head. And part of that goal, I guess, is to take out the old gods and replace them with new ones. And then I guess the players become more familiar with who these people are and how powerful they are and what they did to get there. And we don't have to go over a huge history of, some fictional universe that somebody else wrote. And you get, once again, more acclimatized and used to this universe that you're in.
You also have
I'm actually not a big fan of centralizing a god either as a story. Generally, they're, I don't know.
Yeah, I try not to.
If you're omniscient, it makes the story kind of one-sided.
You also
it's not exciting.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Jeremy also has an advantage because you're only DMing and using the DM gods. You get to shuffle the gods how you want. But for our game, when you introduce a god, or like when you try to show off a god and its influence, does that help you? Does that help you color what you're going to do with their followers, or does that or do you work backwards? Do you have followers and then kind of attribute them to the right god that they fit?
No, I'd probably start with the god first and then move forward that way, yeah. And then have, like, because their followers are going to react a certain way, so, like, I don't know, if you're going to try and gear a story a certain direction, you kind of want to know what they're capable of, like, what their goals are going to be. Because that'll gear the direction of the story.
I can attest to that. For my kind of, like, one that I've set up, I have a few gods, like, kind of in the background, but again, they're more, I find them not to be, like, key figures and moments that you want to have revolving around everything. But when I made my story, I tried to have it, each realm as a small concentrated kind of set, so it leaves me having easier access to limiting, like, deities and things. Not really like limiting because I don't want people to use them, but making it so I don't have to worry about such a list of potential, like, candidates of what could fit here, what could fit there, what could that one do, what could this one do, right? I can kind of cookie cutter deities that either the players have made or I've kind of helped make fit into certain situations and scenarios. And then from then I can, based on that scenario, I then try to find reasons and how to build, like, why did that character, why, like, if a god tried to save somebody, then it's like, okay, why did they do that? And why is that god built that way, right? But I've, in certain things, like in the way of the characters, like, I have for the darkness one, I had a warlock, and their character patron was one of the main deities of the kind of the city. So I had a number of things geared around the final kind of, like, confrontation was built around, like, the climax of the deity kind of coming to power, but I didn't have much in the way of in between of what the deity was doing to solidify that, other than supporting the player. So, and that leaves it up for the player to decide what exactly that means to you and to the god. The god has ideals, but I mean, his ideals are similar to the players in the sort to make it easier.
Okay. We'll go to Sara, and then we'll ask Caden after. Caden will end out, or yeah.
To Sara.
I didn't make a dragon god.
So the story that I'm writing, those 5 books are at their heart more or less about, I don't know, about a world developing, and it does start with a god creating it. And there are a fair number of references throughout.
One or many?
It'll change from book to book as the time period changes.
Yes, no.
Sorry, one god or many gods? Oh, did she freeze again? No.
So I could talk a bit more about my dragon undead god that I made for the warlock page.
Well, let's hit Caden first, and then we'll come back to you and reopen the floor.
So just to talk.
So I know you don't do too much writing, but what would you like? How would you bring up gods into your world, especially having heard us all talk now?
Yeah. Honestly, I would not want gods in my writings, if I'm being honest. I would rather have, like, for example, main characters believing they are becoming gods, when really they are just a fall from grace, so to speak.
I hear ya. So you're an anti-pantheon kind of guy.
Kind of, yeah. I'm not against the idea, but I would rather not have to worry about that aspect in writing lore.
But it makes it easier in some regard.
It does, but
it's something to bounce off of. And as much as people hate to see it in books and in shows and stuff, but if you need a MacGuffin because you write yourself into a corner, which happens way more often than you'd expect, especially if you're not careful, you can write yourself into a corner, and sometimes you need a godly MacGuffin to MacGuff you out of the MacGuffin place.
Yeah,
That's fair.
It's true,
I mean,
though.
You're not wrong.
It's
when
true.
When I built my story, I didn't have, like, too much in the way of gods, but I had a champion, and I wanted to make that champion, like, the concept of the bad character, but not really be the bad guy, to make it appear that way. And I figured I would learn how that would happen as the story played out, essentially. And decisions would be made as certain moments come up. And it actually has worked a lot. You'd be surprised.
I am surprised if that works. That's the word.
I had a number of things where I'm like, okay, how am I going to do this? And then all of a sudden the players stumble into the plan that I'm trying to do. And I'm like, oh, okay, that worked. Like,
wow.
Sure. And like, I had no plan. And I was just like, okay, well, we'll figure it out as we go. And
good for you.
It's happened quite a few times. And I've been like, yes, thank God.
Every time
I had no idea what I was going to do.
Every time I've tried that, man, it's like
we're going over here now. What do you mean you're going over there? Shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. That happened one time where it backfired, but that's because everyone was in a really kind of like weird place and not the best moods. So like, it ended up being interesting.
My one of my big bads, like one of my because I have 5 big bad guys in my DM game. One of them showed up, and one of my characters decided to roll seduction, and he rolled a nat 20, and I'm like, roll with disadvantage, and in front of everyone in the group, he rolled a goddamn number nat 20. You can ask Chris about this, Jeremy. He rolled 2 20s in a row.
And that's where, as a DM, I like the ability to have the option that skill checks aren't always successful. To some degree, it depends on the DC and the quality of the seed and the check.
I agree, but that's why I made him roll
you can't always seduce the dragon because maybe the dragon just isn't interested in humans, no matter how hard you roll. I made him
roll twice.
Yeah.
I was going to take the lower number, and I would have said any number. Even if he rolled a 19, I would have been like, no, you just didn't make it. Two critical successes.
I was gonna say I don't know the context, but I wouldn't make it that easy. I'd make it more like, okay, you open the door, and now let's see if you can do the things to actually seduce them.
I'm just talking about the time Chris seduced Lady Ilmar, Sara, and how he almost derailed.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know why my call just totally dropped. You guys were saying you couldn't